Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Princeton Preservation Group's semi-regular virtual lecture series. My name is Melissa Ziobro. I am the Director of Public History at Monmouth University, and I help Princeton Preservation Group with the tech for these programs. So I just wanted to say hi quick, and if at any point in the event you are having tech issues or you don't think you're seeing what you're supposed to be seeing or something like that, go ahead and reach out to me in the chat. With that, I will turn things over to Gary Soretsky. I'm sure many of you know Gary. He's had a very long and impressive career, serving in multiple different roles, longtime Monmouth County archivist, the internship coordinator for Rutgers, and of course, head of Princeton Preservation Group. So Gary, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you, Melissa, and welcome everyone. Before introducing our speaker, I'd like just to say a few words about the Princeton Preservation Group. For those of you who are new to it, the group was founded by preservation librarian Susan Swartzberg more than 40 years ago, and since then has been meeting several times a year for many years in person, more recently via Zoom, on a wide variety of preservation and conservation related topics. All of our meetings are free and open to the public, so you're welcome to join us again. If you want to be sure to know about our upcoming meetings, you can go on our webpage, princetonpreservation.org, or you could join PPG. Dues are $5 a year, and then you will be on the mailing list. Our next meeting is actually a members-only garden party, and that'll be in June. We'll have news about our next Zoom program coming up fairly soon. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for this evening, Julia Commander, the Alice and Herbert Sachs Conservator of Egyptian Collections at the Penn Museum. Very impressive title for a person of relative youth compared to me, certainly. But she has extraordinary experience. She's a graduate of the Winterthur program in art conservation, and she received further training at the American Museum of Natural History, the J. Paul Getty Museum, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Penn, as she'll tell you, has a wonderful museum, and it's currently undergoing quite a few changes to the building, and that gave an opportunity to do the work that Julia is going to describe with regard to an Egyptian temple that has been part of the museum's exhibitions for many years. So I'm going to turn it over to Julia now.
Great. Thanks so much, Gary. And thanks to both you and Melissa for organizing this and inviting me to be here to speak. I'm really excited to talk about this project. So I'll bring up my slides. Go ahead and full screen this. And okay, there we go. I just recently lost my voice and I've got it back for the most part, but if I have a coughing fit in the middle of this, excuse me in advance, I'm sorry about that, but hopefully I'll get through it and be able to talk to you about this awesome project as Gary was mentioning. So what we're up to at the Penn Museum. So this has been really an entire building transformation project. They're working on several different areas, and for a couple years, the focus is going to be the Ancient Egypt and Nubia galleries. So if you've been to the Penn Museum before, you might recognize this space. This was previously known as the Sphinx Gallery because of the Sphinx in the middle, and you can see a lot in the surrounding area. Can you guys see my cursor when I move it? Yeah, okay.
Yes,
cool.
we can.
Great, thanks. So there's a lot of columns and doors and windows in the background there, and that's the kind of thing that is the focus of my team, which is working on monumental structures for this project. This is a really massive project overall, just in every sense of the word. It involves 2 huge gallery spaces and thousands of objects. And among those thousands of objects, there are about 25 different monumental structures like the ones we're seeing here. So then flashing forward from this space, You can see the deinstallation process happening in 2018. So overall, deinstall took about 2 years. And you can see those same columns and doorways kind of taken apart and crated and up against the walls here. This was right before I started. I started on this project in fall of 2019 with the offsite team who's working on these big structures. So just for a little bit of archaeological context about the objects you're looking at, most of the material that I'm showing pictures of tonight is going to be from the Merenptah Palace complex. So Merenptah was a pharaoh. He was the son of Ramses the Great. He ruled for a pretty short time. It was about 12 years, around 12,000 BCE. So this is really old material. It's from a site in Memphis. It was excavated in the 1920s by a Penn Museum dig. So this is coming from Dr. Clarence Fisher, who ran an excavation here. He took some material and some of that went back to the Penn Museum. The vast majority of it stayed in Memphis on site, but we do have several pieces at the Penn Museum. That's the focus of these new galleries. And the fact that it's a pharaonic palace is really, really unique, and there's not too many of those that exist anymore. So this is a really unique opportunity to look at this material, and it gives us some amazing insights into what those, places of power really looked like in the ancient world. And we have a couple different locations of this palace complex, or objects from two different locations mostly. So one of those areas is the throne room. And this is sort of like our middle scale space. So these are structures that are usually about 12 to 20 feet tall. So a lot of doorways and columns that are in one of these sort of interior spaces on the site. And then we also have pieces of the coronation chapel. And that's much bigger scale. This was sort of like a ceremonial entrance to part of the palace. For this, we have 2 pylons and 2 columns. They're all about 30 feet tall, and each individual structure, so like one column, would weigh about 30,000 pounds. So these are really big. An individual fragment from the throne room might weigh something like 500 pounds, and then an individual column drum from the coronation chapel might weigh something like 5,000 pounds. So it's kind of another order of magnitude greater when we're dealing with those pieces, which becomes very relevant when we're talking about logistics and handling for this stuff. And then taking a look at the condition of these pieces, I mentioned that they were excavated in the 1920s. They were also put on display in the 1920s, the pieces that did come back to the museum with Dr. Clarence Fisher. So a lot of these things were worked on in the 1920s, most likely in-house. It's not well documented, but most of it was probably done in the Penn Museum because some of it's sort of like built into the building a little bit. And this is an example. It kind of runs the whole range of a complete structure to something that's completely restoration, but this is something that might be kind of typical. You can see in blue, that's all restoration material. And then we have the original fragments kind of floating in that restoration. So there's a lot of work to reckon with and a lot of really invasive work that was done on these pieces. This is the back side of that same stack that I was just showing, and you can see some of that older material here. There's a lot of brick and mortar and a ton of plaster. And you can see that, like in this brick chimney situation, a lot of it is very old. It's 100 years old at this point, so a lot of it has gone past its useful life, and it's just not really holding together anymore and has gotten pretty unstable. So that's the kind of thing we're having to deconstruct. Every now and then we come across old reconstruction that's in decent shape, and we're able to keep it and be a little bit more minimally invasive, which is nice when it happens, but it's pretty rare. Most of this stuff is well past its prime, and it's time for new materials and kind of a refresh for all of these support structures. So that was a little bit about, what we're doing and what material we have. And then here's a little about where we're going with it. So these are 2 screenshots from our designers of what the eventual galleries are going to look like. So this is an upper and a lower gallery space. These are 2 floors that are on top of each other. And then all of the heavy stuff actually is going upstairs in the upstairs galleries. all those 30,000 columns that I mentioned. So this is also part of a major building reconstruction, not just object reconstructions. That's happening, it's ongoing right now. It's currently happening where they're putting in a lot of tie rods to reinforce the floor and the walls and things like that to make sure that the building is ready to handle this massive installation. So that's what we're working towards when we're moving all these pieces around. And then here's a little bit of a sense of scale. Those are those really big pieces in that upstairs space. Something that's also interesting about these galleries, it's also a historic building, so that's been a big deal when we're talking about the renovation. There's some really amazing brickwork in these buildings, and the lower floors have a Guastavino arch, so they have like vaulted ceilings, which means we have some tricky floor loading. It's kind of like different from normal floors. So there's a bunch of different teams, architects, engineers coordinating a lot of those things and paying attention to exactly where the objects are going. So then in service of those goals and reaching that vision that's sort of mocked up in those previous photos, we have set up an offsite lab. All of those things are too big to really functionally fit in the Penn Museum labs. So that's why the Conservation Lab Annex, which we call CLA, came about. These are some pictures when we were getting started in 2019, and we've really built up a huge amount of equipment and a lot of fun stuff out there for us to be able to handle these big pieces. It's a dual space, so it's partially warehouse, partially storage, which is really useful for this project. But then we also do have a fully fitted out lab that was purpose built for this project. So we have the things you might expect to see in a conservation lab. We have extraction trunks, little mini fume hood, things like that. So we can do those really fine-tuned treatments, but then we still have that like high ceiling space to get our equipment into the space. Um, our team, that's like sort of the monumental branch of the Ancient Egypt and Nubia galleries. There's other branches, but we have a small team out in this space. That's 5 people. So it's myself and 2 other conservators who are dedicated to the project, and then we're working with 2 technicians. And then we've been lucky enough to actually add another project into the space. Another team of 2 is working on a series of Buddhist murals. So we're sharing this space with other Penn Museum projects, which has been really nice. So when we started this project in fall 2018, we, myself and my colleagues, took a beat because we knew this was going to be a massive undertaking. A lot of these objects are very similar materials, so we knew we would encounter some of the same problems over and over. So we wanted to make sure we were giving the appropriate time to research and development and making sure we did our research before we really dug into any of these treatments. So this is an example of just kind of the starting point. There are 4 doors that go into these galleries. We just started with doorway 1 and just were kind of taking stock of things. And then we did a lot of consolidation testing. I mentioned the condition, things have been heavily restored. They're highly fragmentary. There are also a lot of surfaces that are pretty powdery, which is very typical of Egyptian limestone. So that's something that we've been routinely trying to tackle. Although also a lot of these surfaces are in really good shape and don't need a lot of help with consolidation. So it's kind of a mixed bag. We have the whole spectrum. And that's kind of testing we can do in-house, kind of like playing around with our own methods, but we've also worked on a couple different collaborations to help us sort of up our panel of tests and sort of be more holistic in what we're testing. So one of those examples is ultrasonic pulse velocity testing shown here. This was really helping us out, working with engineers to figure out the internal structural stability of some of these pieces. We could make observations. Certain pieces have like a crack or something like that, we can make a note of it, but we really want to know about how it's going to function in an overall structure. So like, can a column drum that's cracked support the weight of the ones above it? Those are questions that we really needed help to answer. And so this is how that was done. And this pulse velocity testing is really, it's sort of like sonar. It's kind of like echolocation happening to find any cracks or voids in that and then evaluate whether that's going to be problematic or not. And we did have results from this that were really like really very functional results from this testing. And you can see over here on this diagram, this piece, which was cracked straight down the middle, we probably could have ruled that out just visually because it was cracked through the middle, but it was nice to have the testing kind of confirm what we were seeing. And then there's another example of this drum here on the base, which has a less obvious crack in it, and it's very much stable enough to support those above it, which is very important for us to know when this is, upstairs in a public space. But we're going to add some extra banding around it just out of an abundance of caution. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to do to make sure we have a complete understanding of these pieces and make sure we really know what's going on with the condition, like internally. In addition to testing, the objects themselves and the materials and the limestone and all those things, we also wanted to make sure we were testing all the materials that we're using and putting in contact with stuff. So anything we're using for fills or support materials, anything like that, especially since we're having to scale up so many of our techniques and make such big things, we're using some non-traditional conservation materials for sure. So we wanted to run a series of testing. And again, we were able to collaborate with some people on campus, which was really great for us. This is us working in LRSM, which is right on campus, and Steve Shefwich, who is really gracious with his time and helping us out. We selected a set of our materials and we went to this lab and we're like, how can we test the functional properties of these materials? Because we were interested in doing before and after testing and what's going to change the mechanical properties, essentially. So this is an example of us using it's called an instron, and it's like a little claw thing that like stretches. It's like a tensile test for this material. And this is HDPE. It's a plastic that we use for paneling. And so that's like the type of thing that we were doing in this space in order to capture properties sort of before and after. And in between those tests, we were able to do accelerated aging. So this was working with UPenn's Historic Preservation Lab. We were able to use a weatherometer. If you're not familiar with a weatherometer, it's like a big dishwasher. Honestly, it's like putting it through condensation cycles of like wet and dry, and then it's blasting it with UV light. So we have very specific settings for this, and we ran it for a long period of time. There's all our little samples in there. And then we're able to take those out, go back to Steve's lab, and then do our same test again with a set that was aged and then compare results. So this kind of thing has been really helpful. And again, when we're using like plastics and foam and that kind of thing, you also want to watch out for like things that are yellowing really extremely. And does that mean anything, or is it just a visual change and those kinds of things? So all of that research was kind of going on concurrently with us starting treatment, but it's helped us really like streamline and fine tune a lot of our treatment plans. So each object is definitely different. Each one has its own unique challenges, but this is kind of a general schema of how we're approaching treatment and what we're going through. So this is kind of our general stepwise approach, and then I kind of split it up into these categories. And I think the surface and structure paradigm makes a lot of sense to conservators to, have that typical approach of looking from the outside in. But then we're also adding supports here as a really integral part of the treatment, because we're working with the mount makers in a way that's a lot more fluid than I think traditional conservation treatments often are. There's not a clear handoff point where we turn something over to the mount makers. There's a lot of armatures holding things together ultimately, so we work really hand in hand with our mount making team. So then for the rest of the evening, I'm going to talk about a couple of these steps more in depth. The other stuff is, a really important part of the process too, but these are the categories where something I think more interesting is happening or a little bit more unique for this project. So we've been doing a lot of gel cleaning, and many of you are probably very familiar with agar gels in the many forms that you might encounter it in. We're using food grade agarose for this project. It has been so great. A lot of these pieces have just really grimy surfaces, either from 100 years in storage or 100 years in the galleries. They get this gray haze all over them. We did a little bit of testing. It's not super definitive what it is. It's just like grime and dirt. But that gray haze really swells really nicely with the agar dwell time sitting on the surface. So that has been great for us also because it's an easy practice for us to scale up. So we can mix hot agar, pour it out on big surfaces, able to let that dwell and then wipe it up. And we're able to just really lift that veil of the darkening. It's also great that this is, I mean, it's a food grade material. This is also really safe for us to use over large surface areas, which we really like, of course, when we're doing this volume of treatment. And this is just an example. You can see Jenny, one of our teammates, working on this little lintel. And you can see the untreated side has that sort of gray haze to it. And then the treated side has a warmer sort of tone you would expect from limestone. And this is also allowing us to be very targeted. Sometimes we can pour it over large areas. We can also paint it on and avoid any of the incised carved areas because the agar does tend to grab a little bit. So we don't want to lose any pigment, mortars, anything like that that might be in the incised areas. We've also been using the Peggy gels, which is a product from Nano Restore. So that's a polyvinyl alcohol hydrogel. It's kind of hard to see here. It's this guy, and it has the exact texture of one of these things. And this is a kind of a variation on a theme of an aqueous gel. It's nice that it's a continuous sheet and we can get that to kind of skim over surfaces. So right here, this carved area has a little bit of mortar inside. We don't want to mess with that with our cleaning methods. So then we can just skim over it with the Peggy gel. That's been kind of a great time saver because if we have a really, really detailed carved surface, we don't want to be like painting out everything. This speeds up the process a little bit. And it's very gentle. It pulls a little bit less than the agar as well, which is nice. And it pulls up like a sheet. It doesn't, you don't have to peel it off. And like sometimes little agar bits get left. They're also quite expensive though, so it's sort of a balance of using the agar gel on huge surfaces and then these for more detailed areas. Okay, so once we have all of the surfaces looking nice, everything is stabilized, all of the pigment and mortar that I was referencing are staying in place and we're confident that they're not going to get moved, we can move on to the structural work. So to accomplish this structural work, we have to talk about rigging because to move any of these pieces, we need a lot of help from all of our equipment. So before this project, the Penn Museum worked with two riggers who are based in New Jersey, and we still frequently work with them. They come out and will consult on things whenever we need help with stuff. But the sheer volume of moves that we have to do for this project to move these different fragments around and reorient them for different things, we have to have like day-to-day capability to do these things. So our team is trained to do this in-house. We're moving these pieces around pretty much. I feel like I think about it when you have like a ceramic that you have laid out on your bench and you might be doing a reconstruction right there on your bench each and every time you pick up a fragment to, test a join or like see if it goes together and reorient something and look at the other side. Every single time you do that, you have to engage with all of the rigging work. So it is a lot of the workload that we do. And then I think coming into this project, a lot of people and new members of the team are sort of overwhelmed by how much rigging it is and how much this happens day in and day out. But it is really about breaking things down into sort of like simple problems that you can solve with simple machines. And this is an example, a picture from an excavation where they're just using a giant lever mechanism. So there's a lot of ways to simplify this work. And it's really about thinking way back to whenever you last took physics and turning it into a physics problem and not something that we have to do, like brute strength for. This is also like, there's a lot of precedent for this type of work and sort of like a huge history of these things for us to look back on and give us ideas and inspiration for how to move these things around. Because this is kind of new for the Penn Museum to do this kind of stuff in-house all the time. But this is definitely like nothing new. People have been moving stones for thousands and thousands of years, and they have a lot of good ideas about how to do it. So there's a lot for us to reference when we're thinking about how to solve some of these problems. And so this is kind of what it looks like on our day-to-day basis. If you're familiar with rigging and doing stuff like that, you'll recognize that we have slings on this piece. This is sort of the day in, day out. This is the absolute easiest thing for us to do, but it often doesn't work because we come up with like a variety of weird shapes or things that aren't exactly friendly to traditional large object handling. So to work around some of those problems, we have been working a lot on making customized lifting fixtures. Another reason we rely so heavily on these fixtures is that for a lot of treatments, we'll have to move, say, a singular fragment, maybe like 10 to 20 times to check the fitting, to make sure all our cast components are working properly. We have to move things a lot. And so if you're setting up your slings and you're strapping every single time, it's introducing a lot of room for error because you have to balance it correctly. You know, you might be off your center of gravity just a little bit, and it just takes a little bit more time on the setup. It's also introducing a little bit of like, you're grabbing the surface in a way that's not necessarily as controlled, and you might be abrading something when those slings are sliding across the surface as they often do. So it's great when we can do it for like a 1 or 2 time lift or something that doesn't have to happen routinely. But if we're really digging into a treatment, we like to go ahead and just make a fixture for it. And these are a couple examples of things we've made in-house. So this is a scissor fixture that was based on one made at the Getty that we got the plans for and made another one. It's good for like irregular, wonky little shapes. And then we make a ton of these things that we call just these, hold on, let me get the thing to come, there we go. Just the like compression fixtures or clamps. They're functioning like a big clamp is essentially what it is. So we're able to sort of lock down on the sides of that piece and use the rough cut geometry of the stone and then grab onto that and lift from that. And then we can tie our slings into the fixture and not touch the object at all. It's great for us because it's really predictable. We can control where it's touching the object. So in this case, we're able to grab the sides, which are rough cut, and just not even touch the carved surface. So we completely avoid those areas. So things like that give us control and predictability, and it's really fast for us to set up these lifts. It is a time investment up front when we're making these, but then that sort of pays off in the end. And then we're getting creative. We're making a lot of these things. So this was a case where we had to make something very specific for a very specific purpose for lifting these 5,000-pound column drums. This was a plan that we sort of had in our back pocket when we started this project, and it was about a year ago that we finally got our hands on this piece. And a collaborator that we've worked with on a couple other things, Wolf McGreet, based in Montana, who's a fabricator and rigger, was able to make this compression ring for us. So what this thing is doing, all of these little pads that you see on here, these are neoprene. And so each one we can sort of slide in and then tighten down with nuts that are on the inside of these bars. And we have some really like comically large wrenches to set this all up. But what that lets us do, since these drums aren't perfectly round, is really fine tune the pressure of where we're grabbing this and really like snuggle up on it and then tighten in, and then we can lift these column drums pretty easily. It's still kind of, I mean, it's hard if you're the one person on the chain, it helps to like have someone to trade off with because it's definitely like a full body workout. But our small team can lift these in-house at this point with this fixture. And here's an example of it in action. The reason we're doing this, we're stacking these up to make sure that we are level with everything. We're pre-leveling before we get into the galleries because we don't want any surprises in the galleries with these pieces. We do have height limitations. As tall as the warehouse ceilings are, we cannot put a 30-foot column in there, but we're doing everything 2 by 2 to make sure that just each join line levels out itself. And so that's the kind of thing we're doing, just a full spectrum of rigging complexity. Sometimes it's nothing, you know, you just like pick up something, put it in a sandbox, easy, you're done. But it definitely can sort of balloon into these much more complex projects. And then some of the reasons that we're moving all of these things around, a lot of the reassembly is coming down to balancing our adhesive joining and our mechanical attachments. So we definitely prefer mechanical fitting for these pieces. We want them to stand up in the galleries for 100 years in the future. We trust the adhesives we're using, but it's 100 years, so who knows what could happen. We want everything ultimately mechanically fit together, but we do need to use the adhesive joins, especially to lock in current alignment and kind of simplify some of these pieces that are really, really highly fragmentary. Instead of, jumbling like 13 fragments around, maybe you have 5 or something like that. So really wherever we can simplify, and especially if there's kind of wonky break edges, this is a really helpful way for us to deal with it. So this is an example of like an easy adhesive join. This is a really tight fit break, and that corner just slots right back in. So this is the kind of place where we can really capitalize on this arrangement, on the geometry here, and that can really work for us. And to accomplish this adhesive joining, we are very grateful for Carolyn Riccardelli and her team's work on the Tullio Lombardo with Adam. This project has just been such an amazing resource for us, and we have really appreciated all the publications that came out of it, because it's so great to be able to have that to look back on. And so our adhesive mix is the Tullio mix. It's the 3:1 B72 B48N, and this has been pretty much like a huge scale field test of this, and it's been going great. Like, we've been really happy with how this has worked for us. And then something else that was coming out of that Tullio project and Carolyn's studies, I think most of you are familiar with, the problems of iron pins and expanding and breaking stone. Something interesting from that study too was that steel pins, even ones that aren't likely to rust and aren't likely to expand in controlled conditions, are still pretty likely to break the surrounding stone. So it's hard to see in this image because it's white on white, but there's a lot of cracking around those steel pins. And that's not from expansion, it's due from just, the kind of inherent mismatch of the rigidity of the steel and the fact that it's a little bit too much for the surrounding stone. So Carolyn's team was looking into fiberglass pins that had kind of a cool behavior when they faulted and had sort of like a kink before it broke, and left the surrounding stone in much better shape. So we were able to build off of that. We're using carbon fiber pins, but honestly, we're not using pins all that frequently. We don't want to drill holes where we don't have to, and most of the previous drill holes were for like cramps and staples, and they're less like pinholes. Wherever we have pinholes, if it's a good opportunity to make use of that, we'll go ahead and do that. But for the most part, we're relying on adhesive and mechanical fitting. And for that adhesive joining, another thing that study really helped inform for us was the drying times. So it just takes a lot longer than you might think for one of these joins to fully cure. We leave these set up for about 3 months. So we'll do a join and put it in a big sandbox. You can see we're using like crates filled with sand that we have sort of like a garden of. And we will leave these projects just like chilling in there for about a 3-month period. It's kind of logistically challenging often when you have those 3-month sort of like passive wait times, but luckily we have 24 other projects that we can turn our attention to. So there's a lot of shifting around for these kinds of things. But we want to give it that full time to make sure it can come up to its full strength before we make the joint do any sort of physical work and before we put it under any kind of stress. Sometimes we like to use gravity wherever we can, but sometimes things are just too big or unwieldy to get into a sandbox. So we can also bind things with ratchet straps to induce that pressure. That's what's happening over here. This was just a little bit too, like a little too scary, like hanging off the edge of a sandbox. So this was when we just bound and left under ratchet strap pressure for about 3 months. So then getting into loss compensation, I've mentioned that these pieces are highly fragmentary. We're missing many pieces of all of the puzzles. So there's a lot of pieces that we just have to rebuild and we'll have to fill in space for. So this is a little diagram of doorway 1 again, and then an example of where we're filling in that structural material. This is also an example of how we're using adhesive grouping in this diagram. You can see this is that corner that I showed earlier. So this is an adhesive group. And then up here we have 2 adhesive groupings that sort of simplify this kind of wonky shape. And then this had a break there. So that's the kind of way that we're using that to simplify the kind of things that we have to fit together and make sure that nothing is really like unstable on us while we're trying to cast elements or while we're trying to make these structural fills. So these are composite materials. We are using epoxy, so it's a bulked 2-part epoxy to get really good cast of the break edges. We're casting everything over barrier layers. We're using it's like Glad press and seal, the one that you like press onto and it'll really like stick to a surface. It gets a really nice clean cast of all of our edges so that we can really lock these in mechanically like a true puzzle piece. And then we have a separable component that we can take it away. We can do all the sanding and finishing and toning if we need to for these pieces, which is great. And then we have the option, sometimes we adhere them in place, like this little one in the middle, that's adhered to kind of function as part of this unit. A lot of times we leave them as a mechanical join. And you can see we're getting really we get some cool negative shapes out of this process. You can see Michaela, another team member, holding up. We make some really big ones of these things. And since they're getting so big, we're not making these entirely out of the epoxy. You can see there's kind of like the gray and then the white. So the white material is Ethafoam. It's 900. So it's that super dense version of Ethafoam that we can really build with. It's more buildable. It's machinable for us. It's kind of like working with sort of like a soft wood, but we have a lot of ability to edit it and shape it to our liking, which has been really great. We also do go ahead and add, when we have that foam matrix, we like the compressive strength of Ethafoam 900. It's good when it's like everything's spread out over a large surface area. But if we are asking these things to support something directly above it, we go ahead and reinforce those Ethafoam banks with either steel rods or columns of epoxy. So these have a little bit of extra structure built into those foam stacks. And then they just keep getting even bigger. So here's an example of a base shape that we were making and then one that's on top of a column sort of rounding out the shape. We're not filling things just for fun. We're not finishing out shapes with structural fill. We might do some aesthetic finishing of shapes, but most of these are really truly functional to complete edges, especially when we're stacking up these really heavy pieces. Our engineers want us to have more complete contact on a lot of these surfaces, so it is important to have these pieces be structural. And then some of these even get further along the line in terms of increased complexity. So this is an example of a very uneven little column drum that has this base that we made for it. And you can see a couple different things going on. So over in this area, you can see the steel rods that I mentioned kind of poking out. Those will get capped and isolated within the foam matrix. But then in this area here, and then what you're seeing on the underside in the black and the yellow, so that's carbon fiber and the proprietary resin for the carbon fiber, where we're getting really thin. So in really thin areas, we can use that laminating epoxy to fill those spaces out and make something that's pretty strong and rigid and is going to work as part of the unit, but then sort of weaves into those other places. So a couple different epoxies and just making sure that each one suits the needs for the specific issue that's happening with these fills. We also like these materials because they're pretty easy to surface and tone for us. So this is an example of another lintel, and you can see the white foam pieces. Some of those are structural. Some of them, like this one on the side, is more of an aesthetic fill, which are separable and then clip in kind of thing. But it's easy for us to add a little bit more surface material and then tone these to our liking. So this is definitely more in process. These are things we're workshopping with the curators, but we have the ability to do that as we go further along in these treatments. So now just thinking about these treatments overall, I do want to make sure I talk a little bit about the support structures and where we go once we have, all our structural fills made and all of our adhesive joints done. How are we going to get it from being just like a pile of fragments to something that we can put on the wall in the galleries? This is where we are working so closely with our mount makers, and we've been really lucky to work with Jorge Herrera from Mountworks, who's doing a lot of the steel work for this project. And then later in the project, probably about a year ago now, we had a project mount maker start who will also be doing some of the steel work, which has been really great for us. So these are just some initial sketches from our team of thinking sort of big picture, like what do we want for this object? What would be the best thing for this object in terms of getting it into the galleries and getting it onto the wall? Even though we have simplified things heavily with the adhesive groups, we still don't want to be like walking into the galleries with a loose collection of fragments. Um, I think we want to be much more streamlined than that when we're in those spaces. So we have taken the approach of trying to frame things up as much as possible and get these assemblies kind of locked into their mechanical attachments so they can move back to the museum as a unit and then just go up on the wall as a unit. And we don't have to like rig all those individual pieces. So we took those sketches, like this kind of initial thing that we had, and then Jorge has been amazing at sort of translating that into steel. And this is also where we're working really, really closely with an engineering team, especially on some of these really heavy pieces that are, wall support or floor support. We need to make sure that everything is in line and everything's going to be safe when it's installed in the galleries. So here you can see, this is kind of what we saw in that diagram earlier. This is one adhesive group, this is another one, and then these cornice pieces are each there's 3 separate cornice pieces up top. So that's like 5 groups of fragments that are now locked into one frame. And we've done some lift tests with that, and we can move it as a unit without things getting too shifty on us. So that has been the general approach for trying to consolidate things as much as possible and not have everything be too chaotic during the installation. And this is just an example of why we're having so many different teams, back and forth on this. I mentioned working with the engineers. There's multiple engineering teams, so there is a whole like building engineering team for the historic building and all of those things. But we also have structural engineers that are working specifically with us for the objects. So that's Simpson, Gumpertz, and Hager. Our contacts there have been really fantastic about responding to our needs for the project and being, we have the impulse to be minimally invasive with this stuff. And that's a little bit different from their approaches for other things. So they've been really great and really collaborative about finding solutions that work without us having to, cut into objects or like drill giant holes or like core through a column. We don't want to do that. So they've been really creative and really helpful with finding solutions for this kind of stuff. So yeah, it takes many different teams. I think we've been really lucky on this project to have a lot of space out in the warehouse where we have and some time to really get the research phase under our belts and then be able to continue learning on this project because it has been just definitely a learning experience. It's so specific and it's so detailed what we're doing here. So it's been an amazing learning experience, and I know we'll continue learning as we keep finishing the project. So I wanted to thank the collaborators here who have been contributing so much into this work that we're doing. And then I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, bravo. Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. Gary, would you like to moderate the Q&A or do you want me to take that for you?
Yeah, you're very good at it, Melissa, so I'll defer to you on it.
Okay, well, for everybody's awareness, you have the ability to unmute yourself and ask a question. You can also type it in the chat, and I would be happy to read it for you. While everybody's, looking for the chat or their unmute button, Gary, did you have a question you wanted to start with, or?
Well, let me just start with a question about our recent earthquake that we had in
Yeah.
this area, and I wondered whether you felt that at your warehouse. Was there anything that got disturbed by it? And as an extension of that question, is that something that you're concerned about in terms of the future stability after installation of these gigantic pieces?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have talked about earthquakes a lot on this project, especially since it's 100 years out, like it's expected to last 100 years. The engineers do have to do like a lot of calculations for earthquake mitigation. So they have been running the numbers on the columns when they're, saying like, you can do this, you can stack them up. So that's part of their calculations, which we're very grateful for them running those numbers. And then, yeah, we definitely did feel the last earthquake, and the epicenter was like actually quite close to us, in the warehouse, and everything was fine. It was kind of like a little bit of an unintentional proof of concept for some of the bases that we had. I mean, we don't have the 30-foot stack all stacked up, so that has not been tested. But a lot of the custom bases that we're making to make sure that, these are regular fragments or sitting flat and level on the floor, a lot of those were stood up in the galleries. And, this isn't the West Coast, so we definitely weren't like expecting that to happen in the middle of the week. So I wouldn't say we were super like intentionally prepared for it, but everything was fine. And yeah, it kind of made me feel a little better, honestly.
Good little test run there.
Yeah.
I love how you phrase that, an unintentional proof of concept.
Yeah.
I'm going to take the liberty of asking a question because I don't see
Yeah.
any in the chat yet. I'm so curious because I was just talking about this with some of my students in my Intro to Public History class. Has anyone expressed concerns about how the museum came into possession of these items or whether or not you should still be the custodians of these items?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. And the answer is kind of no. I mean, like people definitely ask about it, but there's not major concern since this was like a Penn Museum excavation that was all like documented. Everyone knows that the stuff is here and like how it came to be here. There's like there's extensive paper trail. There's a lot of things in the archives to go look through. So in that sense, it's very much like, yeah, people know why it's here. In another sense, I think like the larger question of like, should we be the continued stewards of this material? It's sort of like it's here now. I think if there was any like ask for it return in the future, I think that would definitely be considered, as other things are with the Penn Museum. There's several of those situations in process right now. I don't think anyone expects it to happen anytime soon. I think if it did, that like question would be tackled when we got there. But I think for now, we're trying to do the best for the material and not have it, languish or, fall into a state of disrepair. So it's kind of not necessarily like in a holding pattern, because I don't think there's like an expectation for anything to change with like the legal situation or the request or anything like that, but just doing the best that we can for now. Yeah.
Thank you. I know that's a kind of tricky and multi-layered question, so
No,
I
no, I
appreciate the
think
thoughtful
people,
answer.
yeah, I think people should be asking that. So thank you for the question.
Okay, so anybody feel free to unmute and just kind of shout out. I'm browsing, but I might not
Hi.
see if you raise your hand. Kelly, go ahead.
Hi, this is Kelly Caldwell. I'm the Director of
Hi.
Conservation at Evergreen Architectural Arts, and my background is in museum work like this, so it's fun to always see this. So thank you for a great
Great, yeah.
presentation. I was kind of interested to know, for where you did install mechanical anchors or pins, did
Yeah.
you use a setting material of any, or did you dry set?
So we are using that same 3-to-1 mix of the paraloid adhesive for potting. We didn't plan on doing that initially until we got such good results from the adhesive joins. So we can bulk that material with like microballoons or like a filler material and make sort of like a putty-like thing. We've had good success with that so far. It's something that we
Okay.
approach like a little cautiously. But we're also helped out by the fact that we're never like suspending something from one anchor or something like that. So
Okay.
there's usually like a broad distribution. There's multiple anchors, or, the pin isn't actually doing that much. It's just like helping out a little bit with a little bit of a mechanical like inclination in one direction. So we're never putting like too much pressure on the anchors and the pins. So that's one reason we feel a little bit more comfortable with it.
Okay. So
When we
basically, like the pins you're relying more on the mount making for like larger structural support versus a larger structural anchor. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the one case where we are anchoring a ton is an object that I did not show, but we have it's called the Funerary Chapel of Capera, and it's this huge like structure, like a room that you walk into, and we have 66 blocks, square blocks that we're mounting on the wall. And those have a bunch of random drill holes in the back, and we've been setting anchors into those. But those are really like lateral stabilization, like they're self-supporting. So they're not like always load bearing.
Okay, cool. Thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for your question, Kelly. Anybody else? Feel free to unmute and just shout out. I'll do another one. Sorry if you mentioned this already, by the way. My two kids are home, so sometimes I get a little distracted during our talks. Can you tell us a little bit about your educational background? Because I think that's really interesting if you've not covered it already.
Yeah, totally. No, I don't think I have. I got onto conservation starting in college. So I was very lucky that I went to Emory, where there was a university museum. So like a smaller version of the Penn Museum, kind of with a conservator who taught classes and had internships. So I was very lucky to get like an early start comparatively for conservation, and then went to Winter and was able to kind of focus on archaeological materials. And I didn't really do this intentionally, but I was able to line up sort of like at the Getty. I was working in the stone lab at the antiquities, in the antiquities department, because I wanted to work on large scale stone. And then from there went to work on a project about Egyptian materials at the Met. And then at Penn, they were like, hey, we're working on Egyptian stone, and everything sort of kind of perfectly aligned there. And that has just been a really great confluence of events for me. But then also like having a fieldwork background, I worked at the Gordian excavations in Turkey, which was really instrumental, I think, for my ability to be able to work in this warehouse, I think, and be very resourceful. And sort of we didn't build it from the ground up. Someone else built the conservation lab part, but then they just kind of put us in an empty lab and we're like, go. So we kind of like built up our toolkits and got all our supplies together. So I think that was also a really important background for me.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I see, is there an Anna with their hand up?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
Hi, Melissa. Hi, Julia.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation. I actually, I'm a conservator too, and I just wanted to know like how much time or how much of your effort goes into administrative tasks related to all of the things that you're doing in terms of, paperwork, insurance, etc., like a lot of back and forth. So I can only imagine that, the amount of load that would be there for the administrative tasks for you. But I just wanted to get into, the behind the scenes of the conservation part. Like I know conservation is a behind the scenes part, but for a conservator, I think these kind of tasks take up, a bulk of your time. So, just wanted to
Yeah.
get to know how do you manage all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a really good question. And I will say at the Penn Museum recently, or like within the past year, we've started doing metrics of how we spend our time. Not because anyone's like really checking up on them, but just because we were curious about the same thing you're asking, like how much of our time is actually active treatment. And they had originally set like a goal for like trying to do 80% active treatment time. And it's not that really. And our team has a lot of administrative tasks in terms of, for me personally, it's like managing the other team members, supplies and equipment. There's a ton of stuff to do with just like equipment maintenance and things like that.
Mhm.
A lot of the admin is taken on by like other departments, which is great. I mean, we have like a great registrar team and people who are doing a lot of the logistics work of like which objects are getting sent to the warehouse when, that kind of thing. So a lot of that burden is shared by other departments, but then internally it's still high. And then definitely like the treatment reporting and all those things, we're trying to make sure we're documenting everything to the fullest extent. So that's, of course, a huge amount of our time as well.
Right. Yeah, I
Thanks
think that
for that
answers my question. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Here is a question from the chat. You've got folks congratulating you, of course, but then here's a question. It says, hi, you may have said this already, but how many people were on this project, including how many conservators, and approximately how long did the project take from start to finish? It's still in
Oh,
process.
so we haven't finished. We're far from
Yeah.
finishing still. Yeah, so the team for the Ancient Egypt and Nubia galleries as a whole for conservation is much bigger. So at the main museum, there's another 3 to 4 conservators who are also working on like the smaller objects for the galleries. So there's like that whole side of things. For our team, it's myself and 2 other conservators and then 2 conservation technicians who are working on the Monumental team. So we're a team of 5 and we started in fall 2019. And the current projections, we're doing a phased installation. So the lower galleries are going to get installed starting 2025, maybe opening 2026, and then we'll kind of like dovetail that into the other one, ultimately probably finishing sometime around 2028. Don't quote me on those dates because they are definitely moving targets. But this is a very long project, and we've had fluctuations in the team size. Definitely, I mean, we've been through COVID, we've been through a lot of different things. So we've had a smaller team and a larger team at various points, but that's kind of the gist of it.
Thanks for your question. Okay, I don't have any other questions in the chat. Last chance for questions from the audience. Okay, well, this was absolutely fascinating. I am simply awed by the scope and scale of this project, Julia, and we might have to have you back in a year to like do a status update and
Yeah,
see
do an update.
how everything's
Yeah.
going. Julia, any last words from you?
No, just thank you everyone for joining us. That was great. It was really fun to share out, and thank you for having me.
Well, best of luck with the project. Gary, any last words from you?
No, just thank you, Julia, and thank you, Melissa, for what you've done. And I look forward to seeing some of you again in the near future.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for joining us, and keep your eye on your email wherever you heard this announcement, because I'm sure we'll have another inspirational program for you very soon. Thanks to Gary and everybody at PPG. Have a great night.